Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, we got to see how ideas led to songs and how Mal was co-writer with Paul for the song Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Mal was excited to be added as a songwriter, but Paul asked him if he could keep his name out of the Lennon McCartney equation. But at least Mal got to keep the royalties for the song, so that was a good thing. And it was also neat to find out that Mal moved in with Paul for 6 months while Jane was touring with her acting troupe. Paul had fired his housekeeper and butler because they were going to sell their story to an Australian magazine. Lily, of course, didn't like the arrangement. I don't think any wife or husband would. And it was funny about Paul and how he got Martha his Old English Sheepdog, and then all that Mal had to do to keep her taken care of. So let's see what's happening today. On Friday, February the 10th, 1967, Mal was given the duty of decorating the enormous Studio One. The occasion was for the recording of a 40-piece orchestra for In the Life of, the working title for A Day in the Life. Back in January, the Beatles had recorded a basic track for the song, and after performing the first few verses, John said that, "I don't know where to go from here." Paul knew that John needed a bridge for the song and said, "Well, I got this other song I've been working on." And to accommodate the orchestral build-up to the future Paul section, George Martin gave Mal directions for the first take of a potential middle eight or bridge. George Martin said it was Mal's job to count down the 24 bars in the middle of the Day in the Life that were still blank. Why 24 bars? Why not? John's vocal had echo, as did Mal's counting, which increased as he counted even higher until the climax of the 24 bar, which Mal made prominent with the sound of a ringing of an alarm clock. The engineer Jeff Emmerich later recalled that it happened to be a wind-up alarm clock set on the top of the piano. Lennon had brought it in as a gag one day, saying that it would come in handy for waking up Ringo when he was needed for an overdub. With Paul's middle eight in place now, Martin prepared to superimpose the orchestra onto A Day in the Life. On February the 10th, the Beatles decided that this wouldn't be an ordinary session, but rather an event. The task of filling the 24 bars that Mal counted out back in January fell squarely on George Martin's shoulders. He asked John for his ideas, the producer recalled, and as always, it was a matter of my trying to get inside his mind, discover what pictures he wanted to paint, and then try to realize them for him. And John said, "I want it to be like a musical orgasm. What I'd like to hear is a tremendous build-up from nothing up to something absolutely like the end of the world. I'd like it to be from an extreme quietness to extreme loudness, not only in volume, but also to the sound to expand as well." The boys had a secret plan, and they instructed the players to wear formal wear for the evening session. Meanwhile, Mal drove to the nearest novelty store, where he bought an assortment of silly hats, rubber noses, clown wigs, bald head pates, and gorilla paws. To set the mood for the classical musicians, John reasoned that if we put them in silly party hats and rubber noses, maybe they'll understand what we want. That will loosen up those tight asses. There was a film crew on hand to capture the proceedings, and Mal decorated Studio One with party favors galore. As for himself, he put on a face mask with a balding head, funny eyes, and bulbous nose. His diary reflected the whimsy of the most unusual and unprecedented occasion. Lights, camera, action, balloons. The next day, flushed with the triumph of the previous evening's session, Mal made the 200-mile drive up to Liverpool, dead set on completing a long-promised makeover of Julie's bedroom. In addition to finding time for tea with his parents at Waldegrave Road, he picked up a load of furniture, some really nice stuff, including a plum Welch dresser that Neil had purchased for their flat. On Monday, February the 13th, with a trailer hitched to the Super Snipe estate car, Mal drove out of Liverpool and kept 40 miles per hour down a mile-long M1, he wrote. "When a police car pulled me over, and the officer said, 'We clocked you doing 68 to 70 over the measured mile.'" Mal protested in vain that he had topped out at 40, but the cops weren't buying it. "Oh well," Mal wrote in his diary, "that's show business. This is my third offense in 3 years. Keep your fingers crossed for me." With Epstein and EMI asking for new Beatles product, Strawberry Fields Forever, back with Penny Lane, was released in Great Britain on February 17th and went on to sell more than 2.5 million copies and to dominate the UK and US airwaves. Then the double A-sided single stalled at number 2, unable to assume the number 1 position in the UK charts. George Martin later surmised that each side of the single had canceled the other out. And then there was the issue of English balladeer Engelbert Humperdinck, who, with the Release Me and Let Me Love Again song, had come out of nowhere to deny the Beatles their 13th straight UK chart topper. While he was disappointed about losing the role, which had ended at 12, Martin describes Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane as the best record we ever made. Mal decided to return to Mosley Hill that very next weekend to keep Lily happy. Paul went with them, and they had Martha too, planning to stay with his father, Jim Mack, at Rembrandt, the home that Paul had purchased for his dad on the Wirral. But any goodwill that Mal may have hoped to create with his family that Saturday was all for naught. In caps he wrote, "Nightmare starts here," he scrawled in his diary. "Lil and I battled all over the weekend. They were on emotional tenterhooks, and they had a precarious financial picture." Mal left Hillside without saying goodbye, but Lil wasn't having it. She called Jim Mack's house just in time to catch her husband before he made the drive back to London with Paul. Mal recalled, "The last time we parted in bad words, I crashed and nearly died." That Wednesday, February 22nd, Mal woke up early, fought back his pride, and traveled to Nims, where he asked Brian if he could have a personal loan of £500 to ease his family's economic pain. The paperwork was completed in time for Mal to rendezvous with the Beatles at EMI Studios, where they finally brought John's dream to fruition. John and Paul's original plan had been to conclude a day in the life with a gigantic in the form of a hummed E major chord. The result had been uninspiring, sending the Beatles back to the drawing board to create a more momentous conclusion for the song. Working in Studio 2, Martin instructed studio personnel to gather up as many pianos as they possibly could. The idea was to perform a thundering piano crash. To get as strong as an attack as possible, everyone decided to play standing up instead of sitting down. Emmerich recalled that John, Mal, and George Martin each stood behind a different piano, while Ringo and Paul shared the out-of-tune Steinway upright. McCartney took charge of the proceedings and counted the player in for take 1. Paul said, "Have you got your loud pedal down, Mal?" Mal asked, "Which one's that?" And Paul said, "The right-hand one, far right. It keeps the echo going." Then John said, "Keep it down the whole time." And Paul said, "Right. On 4 then. 1, 2, 3. The 9th take was selected as the best, with the resulting chord punctuating a day in the life in unforgettable style. The band was working around the clock on the Sgt. Pepper LP, and there was still time for diversions, however. On February 23rd, Mal noted that Paul has an appointment with a Japanese lady who wants to photograph his bottom. He was referring to 34-year-old conceptual artist Yoko Ono, who had met John at an exhibition at the Indica Gallery back in November. In 1966, in the States, Yoko and her husband, Tony Cox, had made a short film consisting of celebrity derrieres, and they were eager to repeat the exercise in Great Britain. With John and Paul firing on all their creative cylinders, George and Ringo were often left with nothing to do. The drummer would later joke that he learned how to play chess during the album's production. March the 1st, Mal went from playing the role of a consummate family man, washing the car and tending to his nest, but within a few hours he had shifted to a drug user. He joined Neil and the Beatles using LSD. It all started at the Bag of Nails, where he and Neil were hanging out with their American friend Steve, who said, "Here's some acid for you and the boys." Later that night, after getting their fill of the bag, they made their way to Montague Mews West. With Jim Mack in town for a visit, Mal was taking a break from 7 Cavendish Avenue to allow father and son their privacy. We were at the flat and had several friends over drinking, listening to music, and I happened to be sitting in one of the bedrooms with the guy who had given the acid to me, said Mal, and he would remember turning to Steve and saying, "Eat me and I'll grow big," and that's when he started tripping. It was incredible, he said. If you're going to take acid, this is the only way to do it. I'm prepared with no preconceived ideas. As with so many LSD users before him, Mal engaged in a rigorous postmortem as he searched for evidence of the changes the acid had wrought. Had it indeed opened his mind? Was he no longer the person he had been before? It had been an enjoyable trip overall. He experienced several micro-incidents along the way that made him question the drug. For example, Mal said, I became lucid at one point and thought I must be insane, but explained to myself that it was okay, that it was all right because I had a beautiful family who would come and visit me, he wrote. Another time I thought I must be a drug addict, but I knew I had a lot of friends who would look after me and keep me supplied, so the world was okay. Neil couldn't help but tease Mal during his time of great vulnerability and self-discovery. One funny part about the trip was Neil ringing Paul to tell him that I had taken it, Mal recalled. Now Paul's father was staying with him at the time, and he was horrified at the idea. Paul carefully explaining to him that it didn't change your personality. I would be the same as I ever was. Still, as Mal's trip continued to spiral, Neil never left his friend's side. Mal described the experience as very colorful, adding that it was nice to have Neil there. I met myself for the first time in acid test. Even hours later, Mal was still tripping. In the shower, he imagined his hair flowering in flying silver whirls, as swirling silvery, shimmering worlds surrounded me. Afterwards, he got dressed, perceiving his workday clothes as kind of poetic refrain, a shining garment that filled the air with soundless noise, living, breathing, hair dissolving, stand serene, filled with poise. For members of the Beatles' inner circle, the opportunity to observe Mal during a full-blown acid trip must have been too hard to resist. Later that day, Jim, Mac, and Paul, along with Martha, turned up at the flat, followed by George. When Mal saw George Harrison while still under LSD, he appeared to be holding an armful of flowers and singing of India. By the next day, the acid was out of Mal's system, but he discovered that psychedelia had fully taken hold of him, that he had been changed by the experience. Now I had always been sober in my dress and appearance, he wrote, but that morning I just wanted to wear the brightest things I could find. So I arrived at Paul's house to pick him up for the session, walking in on Paul's dad with a 6-foot-wide smile, wearing a multitude of colored scarves, ties, and socks. As March rolled on, the boys began to make quick work of the Sgt. Pepper's LP. A deadline of sorts had materialized for the album's completion. On April 3rd, Paul planned on surprising Jane Asher, who was still on tour with the Old Vic in North America, to celebrate her 21st birthday. It was coming up. By the beginning of March, Jeff Emmerich and the other members of the EMI staff were starting to feel the pressure. By the end of the album, it wasn't unusual for sessions to start at midnight and finish at dawn, which put a strain on all of us, the engineer recalled. We sometimes suspected that Mal Evans was putting something in our tea to keep us awake, but we never found out for sure. I doubt very much if he ever dosed us with acid. It wouldn't have been very helpful to the Beatles if we were tripping in the control room. But I suppose it's possible that he might have occasionally spiked the tea with a mild upper. As the Beatles were putting finishing touches on the new LP, Mal and Neil were consumed with a project of immense complexity. Working with pop artists Peter Blake and Jan Haworth, Blake's creative collaborator and wife, the band had envisioned an ambitious cover design. Mal and Neil were tasked with bridging together the various elements, costumery, photographs, props, even landscaping, of all things for the tableau being constructed in the studio. Haworth vividly recalled Mal's good-natured attitude during their lengthy sessions to stage the cover art. He was a very sweet person in a world of posers, she said. Where everyone else seemed fractious and self-serving, Mal was laid back and genuine. And in the midst of everything, Mal and Neil took on the guise of moving men, transporting household items for Ringo and Maureen down from the Liverpool to sunny heights. Up in Liverpool, Gary joined his father as he loaded up the trailer with furniture. They were joined by Neil, who was driven over to Moseley Hill by his girlfriend, Mona Best, and their 5-year-old son, Rogue, who played in the yard with Gary. Before he made the return trip to London, Mal gazed at Gary in wonder, contemplating his good fortune. Love him, he wrote in his diary. Think I'd give my life for him. Hope I would." At the same time, Mal made a point of speculation about his motives for keeping a diary in the first place. "Do I write this for other people to read?" he wondered. Was the act of journaling about the emotions and experience and performance for somebody else's benefits? Was the roadie maintaining his diaries for posterity? So I'm going to end the video here with all those questions. The touring may have stopped, but Mal was staying busy. He was helping out in the studio while the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was being created. He was a big help as usual. He would take Paul where he wanted to go. But Mal and Lily weren't getting along. It's at this time that he tried LSD for the first time. And Mal kept up his journaling where he wrote of what was going on and how he felt about things in his life. Mal could always be counted on in his working life, but in his personal life, it was another story. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed, if you could do so, it would help the channel to grow, as well as giving it a thumbs up. It's all a great help. And if you haven't clicked on the notification bell, if you could do that, it lets you know when a video is posted. More importantly, I want to wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for the Beatles Forever. Thank you.